As many of you know, I've been around the block with games. What you might not know is that Homeworld, as a series, has a soft spot for me, since I've had a continuous love-hate relationship with it ever since it originally released in 1999. I love the world, the concept, and for the most part the gameplay and even the stories, but feel this way in spite of the games each stirring up some gripes. This love-hate relationship is not helped by fans generally nostalgia-goggling the games to hell and back. So, when Homeworld 3 was originally announced, I followed it closely thanks to the long-standing enjoyment of the series, and I was expecting basically Karak in space, which would have been fine by me. So, when I was able to get a slightly late press key for it, I dove in and binged it for an entire weekend, dumping about 14 hours into it total, which is about a playthrough and a half of the campaign with a little poking at the other play modes. And there's definitely some pros and cons, though overall, if I take my nostalgia goggles off, I would put it about on par with the previous Homeworld games overall, at least if you take it solely on the game experience, with its own share of good stuff and its own share of gripes unique to this entry. Now, why I have to say taking it solely on the game experience is because the price is a bit bad, especially since some aspects that could justify the inflations are conspicuously tied to being online. Sure, I can play the campaign while offline, but that is it. The roguelite aspect, which you can play alone, the skirmish mode, which you can also play alone, are both locked behind online requirements, unlike the non-campaign stuff of previous games. Of course, though, online multiplayer requires internet too, but that kinda goes without saying and is at least understandable because it's online multiplayer. The DLC they have lined up on the roadmap also lead to this feeling like they're trying to lean hard into onboarding people into the multiplayer aspects for monetization reasons, rather than the grand space adventure most hoped for from new Homeworld games. This further amplifies the feeling that the campaign alone would be a great single-player experience for half the current asking price. Normally, I would not rag on price this much, but it's something that is becoming far more common with games nowadays, especially in the more corporate end of the pool, and it is something that continues to hold back a lot of these series revivals going forward, at least for me. And frankly, it has led to a growing disparity between price and satisfaction for me, as games have been having a shift towards becoming less of an experience, and more towards exploiting fandoms and sunk cost fallacies. I, however, cannot blame the actual developers for this. By looking at the campaign, you can tell that care and attention was given to Homeworld 3's core campaign by someone, even though you can definitely feel the corporate hands on it in terms of business model and the pricing beyond that scope. And of course, the push for online, always connected integration is its own can of stupid worms. The reason I say this is it feels like some of the developers really wanted to create the cinematic space fighting experience of yesteryear, albeit with modern graphics and even a modernized approach to the gameplay, which they mostly accomplished with amazing cinematics and even gameplay footage if you want to play with the camera a little bit. The modernized gameplay, you can tell effort was put in, but some aspects land great, others, especially the experimental ones, not so much. So, with the games as a service rant out of the way, let's look at the campaign from the perspective of whether it's worth playing or not, if you just happen to find this at a more reasonable price for you. On the simpler end of things to look at, we have the story, which, without spoiling it, is portrayed nicely, but will likely get a ton of flack in other reviews, since it is more of a personal coming-of-age type story rather than a grand space adventure most diehard fans were probably hoping for. Disney comparisons are definitely appropriate in this regard, with a spectacle of a villain and a bit of a wrap-it-up-in-a-bow type ending, rather than complex, nuanced motivations and struggles against outside forces beyond the immediate threats. This will most likely be the biggest problem for some people who wanted just more Homeworld 1, but if you can step away from wanting specifically the grand space struggle for survival and just enjoy a 3D RTS in space with a more person-to-person style story, it'll be fine for you. In fact, after writing most of this review, a streamer friend said it best, by saying they were looking forward to playing more not Homeworld, but Homeworld 3 after their first stream of it. And really, that was my feeling after the first couple sessions too. The fiddly bits weren't fiddly enough to ruin the fun for me. I enjoyed the gameplay and the story was serviceable. Towards the end of the campaign, this shifted a little bit though. Not enough to make me dislike it, but definitely enough for some of the system's less readily apparent flaws to start to stand out. Most notably the AI, or should I say the friendly AI. Enemy AI was fine enough. They liked to make your stuff go boom, and it was a fairly bog standard RTS AI with trigger distances, attack patterns, strategy depending on mission, etc. The friendly AI was serviceable for the most part, but would have moments in more complex battles where it felt like I was teaching a toddler how to run a triathlon, especially when trying to get my support frigates to, well, support my fleet. They would just randomly decide they didn't want to participate in the middle of battle and stop repairing stuff. That said, outside of the weirdness of support frigates, my frustration was mostly down to two systems: the cover system and the formation system. The cover system is the new one for this game, that basically introduces rules for hiding behind other ships, mega structures, etc. to keep from taking incoming fire, or even in some cases hiding from enemy radar. For the most part though, this was not super important, outside of a few stealth missions, since getting your units to precisely navigate into these spots isn't really that feasible or efficient. And really, navigating near objects is about on par with what it was back in the original Homeworld. So it's definitely more of a nudge in the direction rather than a precise location, especially for larger ships since they don't like getting close to stuff. This fudgy navigation was just as frustrating in the modern obligatory asteroid level as it was in the older obligatory asteroid level. The funniest part of the cover system is actually it bit me in the butt a few times thanks to the AI. For example, in one mission, the enemies were launching missiles at us from across the map, and the point was to shoot them down before they reached the mothership. I went to move the mothership near a piece of debris that I had placed defensive turrets on, only for the mothership to decide to go to the other side of the debris. And the extremely smart enemy missiles that go around everything basically use cover the entire way, and my units weirdly kept trying to shoot it through the cover with no effect, rather than flying around it, allowing the missile to hit my ship without a problem. The dichotomy of AI is really apparent whenever we stop and look at how your missiles are just dumb fire missiles, and they will go around and navigate around nothing. So there's really very little point in using them on most enemies further from your mothership unless you really have nothing else to do or you've positioned yourself way away from any debris whatsoever. Though, at least when it does hit, it makes the wait between uses at least semi-worth it. As far as the formation system problem, it felt more clunky than even in the first game, since units would often stop and wait for other units to get into formation before moving, units would go backwards to go into formation as well, exposing weak points and even leaving fights entirely sometimes, so you might just say set no formation, force it to no formation period, which works good sometimes, but it was not an infrequent experience that units would randomly pick a formation if you've deselected the group, then reselected them. So I was fighting it quite a bit in the last couple missions, constantly having to shift the units back to no formation so they'd just go where I wanted when I wanted, rather than trying to fly in complex patterns. Now, I didn't find a huge issue with some of the other problems friends have poked me about, thankfully, but figured it is worth bringing them up. Especially a common one being that sometimes units targeting can be a little bit weird, in that if you have a group of units being targeted, they will focus fire on what the game deems a priority target. Usually the bigger the ship, the higher priority it is. This means that it can sometimes be hard to trim off smaller ships that are being annoying, including the particularly irritating stuff like capture corvettes that steal your frigates, and other ships, which necessitates zooming in and selecting them specifically, sometimes having to fight the camera to get an angle where you weren't selecting them alongside the oversized selection zones of the other much bigger and higher priority units. A bit more of an annoying one I noticed and just learned to ignore was that the game does not really seem to know who owns the ships when it does the voice alerts. The amount of times I heard your battle cruiser was destroyed when I killed an enemy battle cruiser kind of bordered on comical. Really, the only accurate ones are the fleet level warnings such as Group 2 is in trouble, since there's no way for it to confuse who owns Group 2 since only you are assigning groups. Now, I'm not sure whether I'd consider this next one a mechanical issue or a story issue, but the pacing in mission and to a lesser extent in the campaign felt very forced, but at the same time lacking of urgency. This is mostly caused by a couple factors, but the big elephants in the room are the forced warps at mission completion, outside of one particular mission where you need to dock your forces first, and a handful of but thou must type design decisions in battles. That last one basically being a reference to how it limits how you can choose to engage things. Can you destroy that carrier at the first encounter? No, because it would mess with the story. Can you use a system before the plot demands it? No, because it wants to introduce it when it wants to introduce it. Though the most grievous one is that there's a ship that you destroy in the very same mission you first encounter it, that you actually cannot destroy until you get the mission objective to destroy it to pop up. It will literally stay at 1 HP if you sit and camp on it until you trigger that event, in which case it heals and you have to destroy it normally. This type of thing is weirdly what ruins my suspension of disbelief the most, even more than the fact that there's somehow a glacier in space, which is weird in and of itself but was a fun mission regardless. Though it is worth noting, this type of thing has been an issue in games going back to the earliest of days, and the unlocking technology every mission has been there as well for RTS's lifespan. Even though for multiplayer games, this always gives the weird impression that the campaign is somehow a tutorial for the multiplayer, where everything is ready to unlock right away, diminishing the impressions a bit, even though we really shouldn't think of it that way. Probably the last major point that you'll see pop off in reviews and criticism is the fairly major change to the building and research system, as well as hyperspace. The hyperspace one is the simplest to look at. There's simply no more short distance hyperspace jumps. You really only ever do it at the beginning and end of a mission, though the enemies will sometimes do it for plot reasons, which I find our reaction to kind of funny. And as far as the research and build system, I know a number of people are seriously upset by it, but I frankly didn't find it all that terrible other than it making research feel redundant. And that's only because you unlock so few things per mission that it felt like just an extra click to get my ships to start building or use new abilities. It never felt like I was missing out on something because I didn't have research vessels or proper research paths. Though I personally do admittedly wish they would have moved towards more complexity of research rather than simplifying, but that's just personal taste and preference towards crunchy systems. This may all sound like I'm just being heavily critical of the game, especially considering front-loading the negative like this is against my normal review style, since I do like to stagger it. But when I step back and look at the experience I had with it, as well as its predecessors, my feeling is still overall positive. I enjoyed my time with it in spite of these gripes, and this is for every game in the franchise. In Homeworld 3's case, watching the space battles unfold was cathartic. Hiding in debris and clouds to hide my signal felt interesting. Making an armada, or in my case, stealing an armada from the enemy, always feels weirdly fun to me, whether that's happening in Homeworld 1 or Homeworld 3. It is enjoyable, but is definitely in the realm of enjoyable in spite of, rather than enjoyable because. But much like Karak, which I also legitimately enjoyed, if I would not have gotten it as a press key, I would have felt like I was a bit ripped off at the asking price, since there may be $30 campaigns with multiplayer and skirmish-styled systems tacked on. It doesn't help that I avoid PvP these days for mental health reasons, and really, unfortunately, even if I did go back to doing PvP, I don't think the scene for it on these games will ever last more than a couple years outside of private leagues, unless something really gets shaken up in the RTS scene. It's just extremely niche, despite being a niche I enjoy. So, is Homeworld 3 worth playing the campaign of? Absolutely. Are the roguelite and skirmish modes fun? Sure, if you want a few more battles. Is it worth $60 and then a gaggle of DLC down the line for new multiplayer factions and such? I'm not feeling that quite as much. I really do get as much fun out of much cheaper experiences. For pretty cinematics, the AA space is doing great things, and for engaging worlds, indies are wrecking it. And in both cases, these are usually $40 or less, for more saturated and more compelling situations. Though, admittedly, those are usually not RTS, so that is an itch that you cannot scratch there. So it basically comes down to, yes, Homeworld 3 is worth playing, but I would wait until it's a price you can justify for a weekend of RTS gameplay with a few cinematics, rather than a price I'd normally reserve for something that can keep me on the edge of my seat from beginning to end for an extended period of time.